Colonies. When you think of the southern colonies, you might picture big plantations with lots of crops and many slaves working on the land. Or maybe you think of people drinking sweet tea on their front porches. For the most part, this is pretty true. Virginia. There were 5 southern colonies: Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Virginia was the first southern colony founded. The King of England sent a group of businessmen to America to create a British settlement. This group of 214 people landed in Jamestown, Virginia on May 14, 1607. Jamestown was the first permanent settlement in North America. The English settlers were attacked right away by Native Americans. These natives have been living in Virginia for hundreds of years. However, the British weapons were more powerful than the natives. The British forced the natives away. Captain John Smith became the leader of Jamestown settlement. He helped the settlers build forts to protect themselves from hostile Native Americans. He also helped create friendships with friendly natives. Virginia started the first government in America. In 1619, the House of Burgesses was formed. All male landowners in the colony were allowed to vote on the members of the House. This type of government is similar to the democracy that we have in the United States today. Maryland. Maryland was a southern colony founded for a religious reason. A group of English Catholics came looking for religious freedom. They fled from England to America in 1634. These settlers were led by a man named Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore's goal was to create a place where Catholics could live in peace. Although most of these settlers were Catholic, some Protestants also settled in Maryland. Over time, the Protestants started to outnumber the Catholic settlers in Maryland. The Protestants began taking away the rights of the Catholics. Lord Baltimore stepped in to protect the Catholics. He issued the Act of Toleration in 1648. This act declared that anyone who believed in Jesus Christ would be free in the Maryland colony. So Catholics stayed in Maryland. The Act of Toleration also gave all male landowners the right to vote and hold office in the colonial government. Maryland had a similar government to the House of Burgesses in Virginia. Carolina. Carolina was founded in 1663. Today, we know Carolina as the split states, North and South Carolina. The British settlers that founded Carolina wanted to grow sugarcane. However, they quickly found out that it did not grow well in Carolina climate. Instead, the settlers discovered that rice grew very well in this region. So they focused their attention on growing as much rice as possible. Carolina also had a large port city called Charlestown. Today we call this city Charleston. Most of the crops grown in the Carolinas were shipped out from Charlestown. Carolina split into North Carolina and South Carolina in 1712. Georgia. Georgia was the last southern colony to be settled. James Oglethorpe founded it in 1734. Oglethorpe went to Georgia to build forts to protect the British colonies from the Spanish. At the time that Spanish were living in Florida, Georgia was the only colony standing between the Spanish and the rest of the American colonies. Oglethorpe had great military influence and leadership. He became the ruler of Georgia. For 10 years, he was in charge of Georgia. During his rule, Oglethorpe helped form good relationships with local Native Americans. He also made sure the colonists did not own slaves. This was one unique thing about the Georgia colony. Sadly, it did not last very long. Climate. The climate in all of these colonies is hot and humid. The warm weather and fertile soil made the South the perfect location for farming. The colonists grew lots of different cash crops. Cash crops are crops that are grown in large amounts and then sold. The major cash crops they grew were rice, tobacco, corn, and indigo. Indigo is a plant that produces a blue dye. This is the same dye that is used to make your jeans blue. Tobacco was the main crop grown in Virginia and Maryland. Rice was the main crop grown in the Carolinas and Georgia. Southern farmers usually grew more than one crop at a time. Growing season lasted a lot longer in the South than anywhere else in the United States. This is because the temperature stays warmer longer in the South. Ways of life. Most people in the South could not afford to own a plantation. Plantations are big areas of land where crops were grown. Only a few people in the South owned plantations. Land and slaves were not cheap. Plantation owners did not pay the slaves for their work, but they did have to pay to buy the slaves in the first place. Millions of slaves lived in the South from this time until the end of the Civil War in 1865. The fall line is a geographic line where the soil changes. The soil is rockier and is not as good for farming north of the fall line. Colonists who lived north of the fall line used subsistence farming. This is a type of farming where people only grow enough crops for their family to live on. Any leftovers were traded. The soil south of the fall line is perfect for growing crops. Most of the slaves and plantations were located south of the fall line. Because life in the South had to do with farming, only the rich families were educated. Plantations were usually far away from farms where schools were located, so plantation owners had tutors come out to their homes to teach their children. Once the male children were old enough, they went to Europe to finish school. Girls stayed behind to learn how to cook, clean, and take care of a family. Transporting goods. Farmers needed a way to sell and ship their crops. The nearby rivers were an easy way for southern farmers to ship crops to their customers. Many of the plantations in the South were located close to major rivers. This made it easy for crops to be loaded onto ships. The crops could then be sent straight to the buyer. The British bought many southern crops. Other countries and colonies also bought crops from the South. Most people think of the Old South as a place where plantation, green fields, and slaves worked in the fields. While this is true, the history of the southern colonies is more than that. Plantation owners used rivers to send southern crops all over the world. Also, not all southern colonists owned slaves and plantations. The settlers who lived in areas with rockier soil did subsistence farming. They took care of their families instead of trying to make money from selling crops. Can you think of anything else that is special to the South?